This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So the research that I'm going to discuss this evening is drawn from my PhD, which used oral histories and mass observation material to investigate the cultural legacy of the First World War within the experience of the Second World War. It examines how young men in interwar Britain engaged with and responded to representations of the Great War which they encountered both in popular culture and, importantly, from Great War veterans themselves. It also explores the ways the resulting understandings of the Great War influenced men's attitudes towards service in the Second World War. While representations of the Great War in popular culture have been the subject of much research, much less work examines their effects upon the generations who fought in the Second World War. And it analyses the importance of men's subjective conceptions of masculinity within their attitudes to Second World War enlistment. Women and femininity have attracted far more scholarly attention, often from oral historians. Over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm first going to discuss what the oral histories of Second World War veterans reveal about the ways in which the Great War influenced young men's attitudes to Second World War service, and then what they reveal about Second World War servicemen's conceptions of masculinity and its impact, before reflecting upon the benefits and challenges of using oral history in this research. I was fortunate enough to interview 35 Second World War veterans. I was put into contact with some by other interviewees, but most were approached at veterans events and then posted an invitation to participate, which explained my interest in interviewing people about their early lives and how they had come to join the forces. Approximately 2/3 of those who were invited responded, including veterans of the Army, Navy and RAF, but nobody who had served as RAF ground crew replied. This absence may have been incidental, given the more or less random way in which people were invited to participate, but it may suggest the silencing effect of the dominance of flyers in public narratives of the RAF from 1939 to 45. Penny Summerfield and Corinna Penniston-Bird have discussed the silencing effect of the absence of women from cultural representations of the Home Guard, and Al Thompson illustrated in Anzac Memories that men whose experiences are discordant from the dominant wartime narratives can also be silenced. 4 ground crew members subsequently responded to a specific appeal made through the RAF Association's southeastern branches, though still too worried that they would have nothing of interest to tell me. Conducting my own interviews was essential. Not only did it ensure interviewees could be encouraged to describe their enlistment in detail, including how they had felt about it and why, rather than allowing enlistment to feature as an incidental element of Second World War service, secondary to what happened once in the services, as often happens within war memoirs and archival oral histories. Interviewing also, crucially, enabled me to ask men about their interwar understandings of the Great War, the origins of these impressions, and how they had related to their own attitudes to military service. It allowed me to ask whether they had known Great War veterans, what they had heard from them and other family members about the Great War, and to ask questions about their attitudes towards manliness and the status of men in different roles. In addition to my own interviews, I used 93 archival interviews drawn from the sound archives of the Imperial War Museum and the National Museum of the Royal Navy. The Second World War proved a stimulus for recollections of the First. Derek Thurgood remembered overhearing his father and veteran friends talking of, quote, having to do it all over again, or something like that, as ex-servicemen tended to, as the war approached. Other Great War veterans were encouraged to reminisce by a return to martial activities in the Home Guard, and Great War widows, mass observation observed, were particularly affected by seeing soldiers in the streets. One commented, "I always think of my husband, got killed in the last war, only a youngster. We'd only been married a month. It comes hard on the youngsters, don't it?" The oral histories of young men reveal that we should not assume that all those youngsters were also looking back to the Great War, which was, for many of them, beyond living memory. But references to the Great War were a frequent component of enlistment narratives, and understandings of the Great War did have a demonstrable influence upon many young men's attitudes to service in the Second World War. How these understandings influenced young men was in no small part dependent upon the understandings themselves. These were highly varied because the representations available to young men in popular culture in interwar Britain were numerous and conflicting. What they might hear from veterans with whom they interacted in daily life was equally varied and potentially ambiguous. When understandings of the Great War were drawn upon, they did not commonly cause men to withdraw their consent to serve, but did influence the ways in which men sought to spend their wartime service. Understandings of the Great War which young men gained from its veterans can be seen influencing their attitudes and service preferences in a number of ways. Frank Webster, an apprentice typesetter, knew that his father had lost an arm while serving in the army during the Great War. He described his service preferences as a process of elimination. I thought, there's the army, my dear old dad. There's the Air Force. I didn't fancy going in that. I wasn't clever enough, I didn't think. So I went to the recruiting place to join the Navy. Webster was far from alone in deciding not to serve in the same way as his father had, on the basis that he had had unpleasant experiences. But the effect of veterans' tales might be quite different. James Donovan, born in 1924, said that tales of the Great War had made him curious about the Second World War. Donovan: when war was declared, I thought to myself, I wonder if it will last long enough for me to go, and I think that at the back of my mind I did want it to last, so that I could go and join up. You did? Asked the interviewer. Yes, definitely. Why? I don't know. I suppose, like a lot of youngsters, you'd heard tales of the First World War. And, I thought to myself, I'll be disappointed if I don't find out what it's like. As strange as it may seem. But at the time I thought to myself, is it going to last long enough for me to get into the army? John Wilson was determined to join the elite Black Watch when the Second World War broke out. He was 18 and, quote, anxious to get into the army to get out of the office, to be honest. My father was in the Black Watch in the 14-18 war, and I'd heard nothing but Black Watch from him. I think he would have joined up with me if he could. I found the narratives young men heard from veterans were more often about more positive aspects of their war experience, camaraderie, humorous anecdotes, and their pride in their service, and some veterans refused to discuss more unpleasant memories. Youngsters often seem to have taken veterans' pride and enjoyment from even ambivalent narratives. Richard Parkhouse aspired to become a pilot in the RAF. He had heard about his father's service in the Royal Flying Corps, which included crashing and being returned to the army for a lack of moral fibre. But Richard took the positive impressions and heard his mother speak, quote, in awed tones about how Daddy got his wings. Similarly, Jack Pragnell, whose father was, quote, definitely anti-war, end quote, was proud of his service with the Royal Engineers, taught his sons Morse code, and in 1939 hoped that they would join the engineers too. Fathers appear to have advised sons to aim for a particular safe service arm more commonly than they instructed them to evade military service. Alf Wyke knew very little of his father's service, but he was instructed, quote, whatever you do, don't become a sniper. As it happened, Wyke was offered the opportunity, but he declined as he said his father's advice had, quote, stuck in my mind. Close quote. Second World War events might confirm the ideas expressed by Great War veterans. George Cash recalled that his father had convinced him that the army was not the place for him, having heard about foot slogging and trench conditions, and, quote, after Dunkirk, a few of George's mates came back with their tales, and half of them didn't come back. Well, that decided me. I wasn't going to go in. I was told by my dad to steer clear of the army, so that confirmed it in my mind. Having experienced the Blitz, Cash became determined to be a fighter pilot, and discussed volunteering with his parents as he approached conscription age. His father advised him to, quote, go for the RAF if that's what you want, but for God's sake, don't go into the army. Representations of the Great War in popular culture also shaped men's attitudes to service and their service choices, though they were cited less frequently than veterans' narratives by young men. References to canonical war literature and war poetry were almost entirely absent. The significant exception was All Quiet on the Western Front. Amongst my interviewees, though, it was the film, most often the 1939 re-release, rather than the novel that was referred to. Jim Stevens envisaged that the Second World War would be like the First, and said, quote, "The question of avoiding infantry, I think, was on everybody's mind, because looking at some of the detail, well, I watched a film called All Quiet on the Western Front just before I was called up, and the slaughter they depicted there was absolutely horrible, so that put me off the army." Another, less expected influence which young men commonly described as discouraging army service were photographs of battlefronts in encyclopedia and illustrated children's histories. Bob Woodhams was keen to join the Navy, and did not appear to have genuinely considered any of the other services. Still, what he had learned about the last war confirmed his choice. Quote, "Different battles, the Somme, I used to think, I don't want to be a soldier. Troops being killed like that on the Somme, and the trench warfare. No, don't want none of that. I'd sooner be at sea, yeah." So that could have a lot of influence as well. Because, after reading that, what they went through in that, I thought, no, not for me. If I can help it, yeah. Representations of the Great War were certainly drawn upon to identify safer service arms. And this was one reason the RAF and the Navy were more popular than the Army, and specifically than the infantry. In reality, the particular nature of the RAF and Royal Navy's war meant that, provided he hadn't entered a frontline infantry or tank unit, a man joining the army actually had a better chance of coming home. Oral histories also suggest, however, that representations of warfare in popular culture were particularly influential in creating an interest in aviation amongst young men. Books about the Great War aviators and the adventures of Biggles, depictions of warfare in films like Hell's Angels and Dawn Patrol were all seen as exciting images of combat, and often those who consumed them subsequently wanted to join the Air Force. Charles Patterson was, quote, "very much influenced by the film Dawn Patrol, which showed him that, quote, although the casualties were very heavy, it was the most exciting and wonderful way to go to war." Men might draw upon both veterans and cultural representations in tandem. Ian Carmichael understood that his father had had a safe role in the Royal Artillery during the Great War, and he volunteered in the hope of a similar situation. When told that he was not good enough at maths for the artillery, he accepted an offer of service in the Royal Armoured Corps, because of an understanding of the Great War informed by images in popular culture. The distance between the two wars was still so short, and although I was born in 1920, there were horrifying pictures of trenches and mud and bayonets. I thought it's better to drive into battle and have a bit of armour around you than going in on foot. Peter Woodard's preference was to join the RAF because he was interested in flying, but he was also aware that he didn't want to join the army. When asked why, he explained that his father had occasionally, quote, lived Gallipoli all over again, close quote, when he was drunk. Quote, so that's one reason, I thought. Oh, and I had read about the First World War, of course, and the privations of the infantrymen and the army in general, so that's why I thought I don't want to be a soldier. In Woodard's case, the representations he had encountered on a private level matched those that he had encountered in wider culture. Not everyone, however, looked back to the Great War. A minority of interviewees felt that they had learnt little about the Great War from any source until after the Second World War. Moreover, those who had learned more did not always deem it relevant to Second World War service. Ken Hay, who had read avidly about the Great War at his local library, conceived it as an interesting historical event, with little contemporary significance when the Second World War broke out. He said, I don't think I was conscious at the time of war being a terrible thing, or being anything at all. It was just something that has happened, like Barking had just missed out on the Amateur Cup or something like that. Those who expected the Second World War to be different, more mobile, dominated by air power, also tended not to connect the two conflicts. Brian Spragg was quite willing to accept military service, even though he had heard about some of his veteran father's unpleasant experiences at Passchendaele, had read about the Great War, and felt that all quiet on the Western Front had left an impression. Yet he felt he had not connected the First and Second World Wars at the time. Quote, knowing the First World War was a trench warfare, basically, and thousands going over the top regardless of what was coming at them, a different war altogether, a more mobile war was coming up. Spragg also explained that his understanding of the Great War had not seemed relevant because, quote, it was always at the back of my mind that aviation was what I wanted, and the RAF preferably. The Great War appeared disconnected from his anticipated experience. Those who wanted to serve in the RAF and the Navy, for reasons other than it not being the army, also did not necessarily think about the Great War, which was so strongly associated with the army and the infantry in particular. Don Brown had imagined the Second World War as an opportunity for adventure, and he recalled the sincere hope amongst his friends that the war would last long enough for them to serve in the Navy. But, he said, quote, I didn't want to go into the army because I'd been brought up about the First World War and going over the top with bayonets, and I thought I could never ever do that. Impressions of the Great War commonly shaped young men's understandings of army service, and were often cited as a reason they wanted to serve elsewhere. But they look to have had much less impact upon attitudes towards war in the skies or on the seas. Both veterans' narratives and representations of the Great War in popular culture shaped young men's attitudes towards the Second World War. But examining men's subjective reactions reveals that this relationship was more complicated than the assumption that consumption shaped attitudes. Moreover, the relative paucity in oral enlistment narratives of references to representations of the Great War encountered in popular culture in comparison to those disseminated by Great War veterans, particularly Great War veteran family members, suggests that individuals privileged first or second-hand representations of the conflict in their narratives and in their conscious understandings. One veteran's narrative alone could be more influential than any number of books or films, but the meanings which individuals took from their encounters with the legacy of the Great War were not necessarily what one might assume. Even those who encountered the horrific consequences of modern warfare when brought close up to wounds did not necessarily believe that they would suffer the same fate, and young men who had lost their fathers to the last great conflict were not inevitably put off participation in the next. Although some scholars suggest that the Great War challenged the place of military participation in conceptions of masculinity, and that masculinity became more domestic and anti-heroic over the interwar years, expected wartime participation was strongly gendered in public discourses. ATS recruitment literature succinctly described the thinking when it instructed women, quote, "The men will do the fighting, you must do the rest." The male roles of protector and aggressor were staunchly defended, suggesting the importance of military participation in the performance of wartime masculinity. Even if that masculinity was, as Sonia O. Rose has suggested, constructed as temperate, stoic, brave, good-natured, but lacking in bravado, aggression, and heroism. Masculinity, particularly with that label, was seldom directly addressed in oral enlistment narratives. Nonetheless, it was evident in discussion of the consequences of wearing or not wearing a uniform, in comparisons between those inside and outside the full-time forces, and as men compared the status of their service to that of other men. The oral histories show that men's subjective constructions of masculinity were often divergent from the temperate construction in public discourse. While the majority of men probably did perceive of the connections between masculinity and military participation in terms of duty, defence of home and family, and reluctant acceptance of the need to serve, some actively desired military involvement, perceived elements of service as glamorous, and anticipated an exciting adventure. This conception was much more closely aligned to a much older perception of service as a masculine rite of passage. Importantly, the oral histories show that men generally perceived the ideal wartime masculinity as bound up with the status of the combatant, and this ideal shaped their attitudes and their decisions about military service. Men's subjective perceptions of those outside military uniform often demonstrate their conception that they were inferior men. Conscientious objectors were commonly remembered as looked down upon. This might be framed in terms of the objector's failed citizenship. Quote, "We tended to look down on COs," said Peter Woodard. "As a lad, I suppose you got a feeling that the war is on, and pull their fingers out and join up, beat these damn Germans." Alternatively, conscientious objectors might be criticised in terms of cowardice. Reg Day felt that most men were reluctant combatants, but felt, quote, like everybody else, that conscientious objectors were cowards. I mean, I'm no hero, but I'm not a coward either. They were cowards. I mean, they backed right out of the whole thing. I was only going to go and do halfway, as I thought. I mean, meaning I wouldn't be doing the full bit, which would be to go right up to the very front end. I'd be going as near as I could actually get to doing it. I've still got the eye half blind. Here, Day demonstrates a clear hierarchy of service based upon proximity to combat. His poor eyesight, rather than his courage or will, prevented him from progressing past halfway and doing the full bit, which would be going right up to the very front end. This still, however, put him above conscientious objectors, who were cowards because they lacked the will, even if they had the physical capacity. Men in reserved occupations were the subject of less hostility, and many interviewees simply accepted that reserved occupations were making their contribution, although some did think that they were fortunate. Arthur Howard said, quote, "We always referred to reserved occupations as jammy bastards. We thought, quote, well, it's all right for you, you've got a cushy number." The perceived moral legitimacy of reservation appears to have been heavily dependent upon when an individual had entered the role. Those who were kept in reserved occupations were often referred to as having had little choice and evidently doing an important job, perhaps even denied the opportunity of military service. Those who entered reserved occupations after the outbreak, though, were sometimes depicted in terms which indicated their inferiority, and sometimes directly challenged their masculinity. Percy Walder left a reserved occupation at Hawker, manufacturer of the Hurricane fighter plane, in order to join the RAF. He remembered newcomers in critical terms which certainly implied effeminacy, and appear, given his initial coyness, to have implied homosexuality. Both characterizations suggested that he perceived them to possess deficient masculinities. Initially, Walder said, quote, "They were bringing in what we would call them, I shouldn't use the right word because it's the wrong word probably, but still, what I meant, people who had never got their hands dirty, if you like, or one way or another, hairdressers, if you like to put it a bit vaguely." He later referred to them as, quote, "people who had been in a shop selling clothes and whatnot, not what I call a manual man." At the end of the interview, he described them again, perhaps revealing the word that he had earlier avoided. "There were all sorts coming in there, Hawker. I've got a funny word which I use. Posers, I call them. Whatever. Pansy boys. They got rings on their fingers and long fingernails and whatever. But they're not. They're either tailors or whatever. But that's me. I'm rough and ready. Right smart git. I remember him coming in now. The old fingernails were lovely and in a posh shirt. Ha ha ha. Oh dear. But there you are." The subordinate masculinity of reserved occupations, and that the desire to occupy a more ideal masculinity could encourage men to serve, was evident in a number of oral histories. Ronald Oates felt that he had to be in uniform to do his bit. His boss gave him paperwork to ensure that he was reserved, but he felt, quote, "No, I'm going into the services. I'm going to play my part. My brother's in the services. I've got to be part of the services. So I never told my director these feelings, and I never surrendered that letter because I didn't want to be a key worker. George Forster didn't want to be a key worker either, but he expressed his disappointment in relation to how others would perceive him, rather than his own self-perception. Quote, "What does it look like? All your friends going and you're still stuck at home?" Which indicated that it was societal expectations rather than personal conceptions of masculinity which drove his enlistment. These examples demonstrate that masculinity was comparative, and that many men expected to either feel or to be perceived as inferior if they remained outside military uniform. Central to the questionable position of both conscientious objectors and reserved occupations was that neither position demonstrated one's willingness to participate in the masculine role of combat within the war effort. A military uniform, however, was a clear signal of intent, and thus a symbol of masculinity in wartime. When James Oates learned that he was reserved because his work, quote, "bricking up windows in hospitals and schools, putting up air raid shelters," was air raid precaution work, he said, quote, "I felt guilty like any young man, so I joined the Home Guard." Oates' guilt at not being in the services demonstrates his conception of military service as a crucial element of wartime masculinity, and his response demonstrates that he saw Home Guard membership as providing some compensation for his otherwise threatened masculinity. Cyril Price was in the air raid precautions and, quote, "envied one's friends in the Home Guard because they actually had a Lee Enfield rifle to walk. We didn't have rifles. What a privilege to have a real rifle to walk around with." My interviewees who had been in the Home Guard, like those of Penny Summerfield and Corinna Peniston-Bird, tended to have felt pride in their Home Guard uniform and have valued it as a military signifier. Still, the Home Guard was a subordinate masculinity to that of the full-time forces. As Ken Hay expressed it, quote, "There was a certain attraction about being in army uniform. I think that applied to most people, which the Home Guard bits didn't satisfy. And it looked good being on leave." In some narratives, a desire to possess uniform drove enlistment, rather than a desire to defeat the Germans or perform a particular wartime role. Bob Woodham's enlistment narrative was punctuated by a desire, quote, "just to get into uniform." Prior to the war, Woodham's wanted to join the Merchant Navy. Quote, "But of course, when it all started, I thought, uniform. I'll go for the Royal Navy." He had seen his brother in his Navy uniform with, quote, "the big bell bottoms and chinley collars and what have you. Yeah, so I liked that. And I thought, yeah, I'll have some of that, you know. But that was what really attracted me. But I did want to go to sea." He noted, quote, "The Merchant Navy never got a uniform, you see, so I think it was the attraction of uniform that made up my mind." Later in his interview, Woodham said, quote, "I think most of us at that time wanted to get into the forces, regardless. We didn't have a clue what it was about, but it was the fact that we wanted to get into uniform." Men took pride in their uniforms and other items which signified military participation. Men on deferred service in the RAF Volunteer Reserve were given silver badges, jealously remembered by those in the Air Training Cadets. As Bob Lowe recalled, those with badges, quote, "were the cat's pyjamas, because they were already in the RAF then, of course." They also associated uniform with sexual allure. Maurice Marriott went as far as to comment that one of the attractions of the RAF was, quote, "thinking of all the girlfriends we'd get when we were fighter pilots and all that," before laughing. In more general terms, men remembered uniform as something which increased their self-confidence. George Cash actually swaggered to emphasise his meaning when he explained his RAF uniform made him feel he, quote, "was it." He remembered many of the young men in his area were, quote, "going off into the army and they were coming home with their nice private's uniforms and all the rest of it. One or two managed to get into the Navy and they looked even smarter. But I thought to myself, it's not for me." With the Battle of Britain, the RAF were in the public eye, And Cash recalled, quote, "The RAF uniform in certain areas where I lived, people looked at you with respect, so to speak. And eventually, when you passed out and got your wings, and so you got your stripe, by gum, you're king of the castle." For some others, military uniform simply prevented them from feeling inferior. George Stagg said that he did not feel superior once in the army, quote, "because if you walked down the street and there was 200 people, there would be 150 in uniform. So you were one of the crowd. If I hadn't been in uniform, I'd have felt really out of place, really and truly. I'd have hid behind a tree." The sense that everyone was in uniform may well have increased as the war continued and uniformed men became more ubiquitous. A sense that military service was a man's obligation during wartime was evident in a number of testimonies. Arthur Howard volunteered, aged 19 in 1939, and was, quote, "quite happy to go when I made my mind up," close quote, but he considered it, quote, "something I had to do," close quote, rather than an adventure. Asked if he, quote, "felt it your duty to serve in the forces, or was it something that you just wanted to do?" he related his decision to patriotism and to social expectation. Quote, "We're British, aren't we? Well, English, not bloody British. But, oh no, we were. You think to yourself, well, we've got to pull together. That's all. I didn't go because I thought it would be a holiday or nothing, I just thought, well, you're expected." Similarly, Ken Hay spoke of military service as an obligation. He framed his Home Guard enlistment as, quote, "doing his bit," and he said he thought, quote, "well, I think I ought to go in the army, and I ought to go in the service." This feeling appears to have been influenced by comparisons with the men around him, particularly his brother, who was already serving in the commandos, and, quote, "would come home with his fighting knife down here, his badge with the dagger, the bee's knees." Hay came to feel that he was not, quote, "doing my bit. My brother was doing his bit. He'd served in Norway, and now he'd served and was wounded at Saint-Nazaire, and other people had gone in the army, or navy, and whatnot, used to come home on leave. These are the chaps who are doing their bit, and they've all got something, and I'm outside this. I mean, being in the Home Guard didn't get me into that club as such." Other men appear to have accepted service in order to protect their masculinity from scrutiny, although personally they would much rather have not served. For example, Mr. Sweetland distanced himself from a military masculine identity, saying he'd been brought up to shun uniform and plainly did not want to enter the forces. Yet rather than find a way out of service, he waited until he was called up, and then promptly set about moving from his assigned role of signaller to a clerking post, his pre-war job. Others appear to have opted for uniformed roles because it masked attitudes which would otherwise have challenged their masculinity. Hugh Jenkins seriously contemplated conscientious objection and was considering joining the Friends Ambulance Unit when he learned that the Observer Corps was recruiting. He seized the opportunity to join. He was able to reconcile the Observer Corps' non-combatant and defensive activities with his pacifism, but the only reason that this role was preferable to the Friends Ambulance Unit seems to have been that it was in the military. He subsequently joined RAF Fighter Command, which he conceptualised as defensive, gallant and noble because they never bombed civilians. This allowed him to access a still more masculine role without feeling he had compromised his principles. There was not a simple binary opposition between those in and out of the services, but a complex and in some ways contested hierarchy of masculinities. When asked whether servicemen were quote, "seen as sort of, well, any more or less manly than those who weren't in the services," Les Temple said, quote, "well, yes, I mean, that was the ultimate, getting into the services to fight a war." Close quote. In comparison, for him, those in reserved occupations and Bevan boys were, quote, "a grade below servicemen. They were looked upon as being unable to get into the service, just about fit enough to go down a mine, you see, which wasn't a glamour situation." He said that the RAF uniform was something to be proud of, quote, once you got your stripes and your wings, close quote, and as aircrew, quote, the girls used to look to go out with you, and there was a bit of glamour to it, because you were on operations, you were in a dangerous situation. This suggests that proximity to combat and to danger was related to wartime masculinity. Temple said that he would not, however, have, quote, felt very good, close quote, to have a ground crew position in the RAF, because, quote, I wasn't looking to be a mechanic or radio operator on the ground, but they used a lot of ladies, WAFs, on the ground for that, you see, and I wouldn't have been happy about it, close quote. Doing the same job as a WAF, he, quote, wouldn't have felt that I was contributing enough to ending the war. Similarly, Ken Hay seems subconsciously to have conceived of a hierarchy of wartime roles in which those performed by women were less masculine than others. When asked if he would have felt, quote, less like you were doing your duty or possibly less manly if you had been placed in a quartermaster role or moving supplies around rather than being in a combat role, close quote, Hay pondered the correct wording before saying, I felt being in the infantry that I was doing all I could do. That was all that was expected of me. If I'd been doing a more sedentary thing like you're suggesting at the quartermaster's stores, I think I would have been a bit fed up with myself. I think I would have felt this could be left to the girls and that we ought to be doing something a bit more manly than this. I don't think I'd have much to boast about. Reg Day could have been reserved as a driver for a company salvaging aviation parts, but he had wanted to be more involved in the war. He explained that he had not seen assisting aviation production as a sufficient contribution, because this was something that his wife was doing. If a woman could do his job, then he could be freed to perform a role more directly connected to combat. A reserved occupation, quote, wasn't near enough to the war for me. See, when I was here, RAF Dunsfold, where the interview was conducted, I was putting bombs on aeroplanes that were going to kill Germans, and that was what I wanted. They wanted our country, and bugger them. My examination of oral interviews with Second World War servicemen suggests that military service was integral to many men's subjective conceptions of wartime masculinity. Men's attitudes to conscientious objectors and those in reserved occupations suggest that they felt men were, at least, required to be willing to participate in military service. One way to demonstrate willingness and thus to perform a more acceptable wartime masculinity was by joining the Home Guard. Both those who could not join and those waiting to join the full-time forces used the Home Guard in this way, although it also functioned, sometimes simultaneously, as a genuine expression of their desire to participate in the war effort. Still, descriptions of the Home Guard as a temporary solution and its questionable position in public discourses of masculinity emphasise that it was subordinate to the full-time forces. Examination of the hierarchies conceived by men and the fact that some went to great lengths to avoid reservation suggest the importance of specifically military participation to wartime masculinity, as does the pride which men took in it and its association with sexual allure. In addition, the overt comparisons and judgments made by some about the roles performed by women and by other men suggest that military participation was important to performing masculinity specifically, as well as to performing the more flexible gendered obligations of the active wartime citizen. I also found that men's subjective masculinities in wartime Britain were varied and that men attempted to position themselves at varying distances from the hegemonic wartime masculinity. There are parallels here with Penny Summerfield's identification of heroic and stoic narratives amongst women war workers, although some certainly sat in between these poles. Heroic women were keen to be involved in the war effort and determined to obtain roles connected to it, while stoic women had thought about service in relation to, quote, personal rather than national goals. Some heroic men clearly strove to perform hegemonic wartime masculinity, but this was less important to others who sought to balance societal expectations with their personal desires and stoically endured service. The societal expectation was clear, and it was anticipated that shame and emasculation might result from a failure to at least approximate wartime masculinity. Thus, while many men aspired to get into uniform to access that masculine image, those less keen on participation often found ways to negotiate their service while remaining publicly compliant with wartime masculinity. Reflecting upon the discussion of masculinity within these interviews, I was struck by the extent to which masculinity did not have to be read against the grain of the interview. It was not always explicitly expressed within discussions of uniform, for example, but men commonly considered their own position in relation to that of other men. Even more striking were the instances, less common, when men made direct comparisons with the roles of women. These instances were normally, though not only, when men were encouraged to reflect upon manliness, towards the end of interviews when, I hope, a trust had developed between myself and the interviewee. It would be overstating the case to say that I found all interviewees were willing to reflect upon their conceptions of masculinity. Indeed, I took to asking about manliness as it seemed to mean more to interviewees. But still, I was surprised by the extent to which men seemed to have been aware of their sense and experience of masculinity, and their ability and willingness to reflect upon it in the present day. The length of my interviews, normally 3 to 4 hours in total, helped to forge a connection with interviewees. And it's possible that this may have enabled some of them to present more reflective and more open answers. Corinna Penniston-Bird found that in interviews with members of the Home Guard, the dominant image of the farcical televised representation, Dad's Army, was commonly acknowledged before being juxtaposed with contradictory memories of joining with a desire to help the war effort, of local units as organised, equipped and useful. When these narratives met a non-judgmental response, alternative interpretations were often forthcoming later in interviews, and interviewees, quote, became less likely to present their memories in the light of previous audience responses, less likely to produce the dominant cultural construction of the force, and more confident about asserting their own authority in interpreting its significance. A similar process was visible within my own interviews in relation to enlistment motivations. Peter Woodard initially explained that his volunteering for the RAF was due to his desire to fly, like many other RAF recruits. Yet deeper questioning later in the interview revealed that he was trying to balance personal preferences rather than fulfill a desire to participate in the war effort. He said of his volunteering, quote, "I can't say there was anything really heroic about it or anything like that. It was just the fact that the war was on and we knew we'd be in the forces eventually if the war carried on, which was the likelihood it was going to anyway, and we wanted to get into something that we wanted to do." He later reiterated that he had not considered the idea of doing his bit for the country, rather that he was aware of the, quote, potluck of conscription that was looming. Similar effects may also have occurred in relation to patriotism, which a number of interviewees immediately ascribed their enlistment to, almost as an answer which might make the question go away. But when enlistment was re-examined later in the interview, alternative explanations were added to or replaced patriotism. In the Oral History Society's journal, Corinna Penniston-Bird recently discussed the implications for oral histories of the Second World War of the dominance of the People's War narrative in relation to the modern-day currency of patriotism. She suggested that while all in it together and doing your bit were sentiments which both an interviewee and an interviewer could be expected to understand, and which are uncontested in the dominant narrative, patriotism was more difficult to express. Like Penniston-Bird, I found my interviewees would reach for Empire Day and lessons about the scale of the British Empire in their youth to explain or justify the patriotism which they remembered. It is also possible, however, that the weakness of the association between patriotism and the Second World War in popular narratives, which Penniston Bird identified, enabled my interviewees to move away from and ultimately reject or place minimal emphasis upon king and country as explanations of enlistment. Over the course of an interview, they could transition to the nuanced explanations we have seen here, which allow space for self-interested motivations. These instances highlight the value of empathetic and non-judgmental interviewing. In addition, it highlights the potential value of revisiting complex interviews with an interviewee, as more nuanced and apparently more open responses emerged. Having combined oral history interviews, largely conducted in the 1990s, 2000s, and in my own case 2010 and 2011, with mass observation material constructed in the 1940s, I can vouch for the compatibility of the two mediums. Both provide access to the subjective and reflective thoughts of individuals and can be combined to enable broader considerations of attitudes. Mass observations diaries, even more akin to oral narratives, are a medium which I'm now very keen to explore and compare and contrast with oral narratives. I was also struck by the extent to which the attitudes prevalent within the responses to mass observations, directive replies and surveys mirrored those recalled by interviewees. Discussion of conscientious objectors, for example, encompassed the same range of opinions and rationales as was indicated by mass observation. It is an interesting support for oral history that contemporary and recent attitudes display more commonality than divergence. In addition, discussion of such topics, as well as enlistment more generally, demonstrated that most interviewees were quite capable of reflecting upon how they had felt at the time and how they feel about the issue now, as well as how they feel now about their feelings then. This is not to encourage an uncritical, unproblematic treatment of the potential of oral narratives to reflect the concerns of the present-day narrator, but a reminder that optimism is possible. Finally, I'd like to reflect briefly on the benefits and challenges of reusing archival interviews. It's often suggested that more oral historians should reuse interviews from the many existing collections, and I certainly agree with that sentiment. Archival interviews helped to significantly expand my research within a manageable timeframe, and importantly provided access to the enlistment narratives of a more complex group of people. I was able to partly counter the large number of RAF veterans within my own interviewees through the selection of Army and Navy veterans from archival collections. And significantly, while my own interviewees had mostly been born during the 1920s and served as young men, archival interviews provided access to the narratives of older servicemen born before and during the First World War. Archival interviews also broadened the geographic spread of the interviewees, though even this selection does not permit the examination of regional variations in attitudes to service. Using archival oral histories involves different practical considerations to conducting one's own interviews. It is more difficult to discern the effects of intersubjectivity within an archival interview, and though I took notes about the dynamic and apparent ease with which interviewees spoke, these assessments are made at a far greater remove than in one's own interviews. It is also, I found, important to make notes about one's own response to archival interviewees and archival interviewers, not least because these individuals are less memorable and individual than those with one's own interviewees. With my own interviews, at the point of writing, I could work from transcripts in conjunction with sound files. I did not expect this to be possible with archival material because it's so prohibitively expensive to obtain. I made detailed transcripts and notes to compensate as much as possible. In the event, at the point of writing, the Imperial War Museum's redesigned online catalogue did provide remote access to some of the interviews and enabled them to be reheard at this later stage. I hope that this is expanded and that other archives increasingly follow suit. As such, access removes one of the challenges of reuse, and indeed the prospect of reuse from one's own desk or sofa is one which makes reuse of archival material all the more attractive. More fundamentally, when using archival interviews, the inability to interject your own questions or ask for clarification or expansion is an inherent frustration, and one with important implications. Not only do occasional ambiguities result, but more significantly, the questions asked do not always establish the upper limit of an interviewee's relevant knowledge or experiences in relation to one's own research. For instance, James Donovan, the interviewee who was made curious by tales of the First World War, never says whose tales these were. He had a veteran father, but he does not indicate whether or not he ever said anything about the Great War. We cannot now ask. Such chance inclusions are valuable evidence, notwithstanding our inability to establish how much more we might have heard. But our inability to chart the upper limit of what men learned, or the ways in which they were influenced, necessitates the inclusion of the caveat "at least" in claims based on archival interviews of this kind, and the acknowledgement that the archival interviews present a greater possibility of underestimating some elements of my research. This limitation aside, I found reuse a rewarding and useful element of this research. Thank you.